Good afternoon. This is Ingrid Klingmann from EFGCP. I'm the chairman of EFGCP, and I used to be a work package leader in the EUPATI IMI project, responsible for, amongst other things, organizing, supporting the webinars that we were doing in EUPATI. And it's my big pleasure to welcome you today to a very important first webinar of a series of webinars that we are going to hold. And this is about one of the key outcomes of the EUPATI project, which is the guidelines that we developed within that project to help our environment to find best practices, best ways to include patients into different aspects of the medicine's development process. We are waiting a couple of minutes because the attendees are at the moment getting into the system. We are using this time a new version of GoToWebinar, so we had a bit of surprises from a technical point of view, so just stay with us for a couple of more minutes and then we will get going. Yeah, I think we should start because we have really a lot to discuss. What we will do today is we will hear first a short introduction, then we will go through that guideline that you have all received as pre-reading concerning the involvement of or the guidance of patient involvement in industry-led medicines R&D, and then we will have step-by-step discussions of opportunities for questions and answers and discussions about the individual topics. The key speaker today will be Kay Warner. She is patient engagement lead at GSK in the UK, and Kay was one of the key authors for this guidance, very much involved in not only bringing in the topics that should be discussed, but also with the experience of her strong involvement in EUPATI and the discussions we had there, helping to come up with key recommendations from her own experience and collecting and integrating the experience from the other colleagues. Of course, this was a team. Two other key participants in getting and bringing this guideline together were the two leaders of the Work Package 7, which is on one hand David Harry from EATG and Wolf See from Bayer, or consultant to Bayer, and these two gentlemen will be supporting Kay in answering your questions, in giving further thoughts, a bit of background of the things that had been discussed that led to, let's say, the decision to make that recommendation and not another one, and give you in this way a bit of background and flavor on how this guideline was developed. So with this, Kay, I think we should really start, and I would like to give you the floor. Thank you very much for having taken the lead here in this webinar and will guide us now through the guidance.
Thank you, Ingrid, for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm glad that you could join us all today. So my name is Kay Warner. I work for GlaxoSmithKline in the research and development arm of the organisation. I've been with the company for 25 years. The last 10 years have been my involvement in patient engagement at GSK in a global role. I've been responsible for bringing in many patients and patient advocates, caregivers, etc. into the company to really understand and listen to the voice of the patient in terms of how they manage their illness, what their experience is with disease, how they manage their treatments, their experience in clinical trials, etc., etc. And that's been a very fulfilling role for me. As Ingrid mentioned, I've also been part of EUPATI since its inception in 2012 and have been involved throughout the project for its 5 years, and will continue to be involved as it's now a programme under the European Patients Forum. I'm very much looking forward to the next chapter in the EUPATI history. So I've got a couple of slides to share with you today, and then I'm going to switch over to go through the guidance document in a bit more detail and really just pull out some of the highlights from each of the sections. And I would encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation and also the guidance overview as well, if that's great, and Ingrid will be very kindly moderating those questions for us. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my next slide, which hopefully would work. Okay, so what I'm going to go through today in terms of the flow is to describe why we have the guidance in the first place, to discuss the process that we followed, and to also talk about the content of the industry guidance at a glance, and then, as I mentioned earlier, to go through the highlights of each chapter, where I will switch to the guidance document. And as I say, I do encourage questions throughout the discussion. So why do we have the EUPATI guidance documents? There are actually 4 guidance documents in the series, and there will be different seminars on each of these. This one will really concentrate on patient involvement in industry-led R&D. Basically, patients and patient organisations want to be more involved more widely. We know that as a fact. There's a lot of discussion externally around patient involvement. Lots of different organisations, projects, collaborations have sprung up over the period of EUPATI starting, but actually before that as well. But what we want to see is more patient involvement included earlier and in the post-approval stages as well, and not to be confined just to clinical development, which in some cases has been happening in the past. And not to say that's not a good thing, but we really would need to make sure that the patient voice is built in before the key decisions are taken in a medicine's development life cycle. So really, we wanted to make sure that we could meet that gap. The overarching guidance on meaningful and ethical interaction is actually missing in many areas we found when we started the EUPATI project, and particularly in the R&D process. And this does then cause some insecurity in terms of, can we actually engage patients? What does that look like? What does the engagement look like? How can patients be involved? What's their roles, etc. So we found that during the EUPATI project, those questions were springing up a lot of the time. Most of the existing codes and regulations we found when we reviewed them were covering legal and ethical content. They were talking about collaboration with patient organisations and didn't mention any involvement in R&D processes with patients. And some of the codes that we did review, which are actually listed in the appendix of the guidance document, were the codes from FPA, the EATG, the European Patients Organisations Code of Conduct, conversations and records from ECAB, the EMA framework, and HTI. So those were just a number of the codes that we did review before we actually developed the guidance document. And then actually we found that the language that's used in some of those codes needed to be more directive towards patient involvement. As I said previously, there was a lot around how you would conduct conversations with patient organisations, but it really didn't direct towards actual patient involvement, and we felt that was, again, a missing piece in the puzzle. And actually as well, when we had some of our discussions to develop the guidance document, we thought that there needed to be a clear default statement that said that collaboration is allowed unless it's expressly forbidden. So, as I mentioned, we did have a very good review and consultation. A lot of the consultation was around 2 workshops that were held in July 2014 and July 2016. The first workshop involved patient organisations and industry representatives. The second workshop involved patient organisations and regulatory authorities to really get their input around the barriers and considerations for patient involvement. It generated 22 case studies, which enabled us to look at some of the existing best practices and experiences and examples across many of the stakeholders to really learn from their experiences and build that into the guidance document. We also had extensive internal consultation within the consortium members. Remember that EUPATI is a consortium of patient organisations, industry members, and academia and non-for-profit organisations as well as we do have an ethics committee and an regulatory panel to give us advice as well throughout the life cycle of EUPATI project. So they were involved in the internal review before we went out to an intensive public consultation, which ended in September 2016. So as I mentioned previously, there are 4 guidance documents, but I'm going to concentrate on the industry-led R&D document today. As you will see on the screen here, those 4 guidance documents were published in December 2016. There were a lot of contributions from many people along the process of the review and consultation. And unfortunately, I don't have time to name them all here, but their names, or the names of the organisations, can be found on eupati.eu, EUPATI resources. So I would encourage you to go in there and access the 4 guidance documents, but also take a look at the very long list of contributors to these documents. So in terms of the guidance on interaction in industry-led R&D that we're going to speak about today, I want to talk about the specific instances of interactions to explore the synergies and how we can create roles for patients in R&D. But we want to make that more systematic. We have very good examples of patient involvement already, as I mentioned, through the case studies, but they are quite sporadic. And I think you'll find within many industry groups or industry partners that, again, there's not a systematic approach or way to involve patients. So really we wanted to take the guidance document and really try to take through not a step-by-step in detail approach, but a systematic kind of idea of how patients can be involved going forward. So the guidance actually will then define what a patient is. We had a lengthy discussion in various EUPATI meetings about this. We felt it was really important, and you'll hear me touch on that a bit more when I switch to the guidance document itself. We wanted to have a guidance document that would cover operating procedures, and that includes like interactions and principles. We wanted to actually define what the interaction would look like and cover that in more detail, and I'll go through that again in the guidance document. And the guidance covers ways for identifying patients, because a number of times you'll hear people saying, well, I'd love to engage a patient, but how do I go about doing that? You know, what sort of groups do I need to work with? And again, the guidance document does give you some pointers there. We wanted to cover key elements of what should be covered in a written agreement, the rules for compensation, and cover events and hospitality, how you might you know, obviously cover travel costs and help people actually, you know, follow and actually contribute to patient involvement. And then in terms of, most importantly, was obviously transparency and disclosure, which again I'll mention. Also within the guidance document, we've delivered a roadmap on patient and public involvement in R&D, and you'll see that when I present the guidance document. Plus we've got codes of conduct, codes of practice that we reviewed prior to and during the drafting of the guidance document. So for some reason I can't come out of my slides. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there and see if David or Wolf have anything they wish to add before I switch to the guidance document.
Nothing from my side.
No, nothing from my side either.
Good, okay, thank you guys. So just a reminder to be asking your questions as we go through. So I'm going to go through the first page of the guidance document, not in a great deal of detail, you'll be pleased to hear, but just really just to pick out the highlights. I will then take a pause at the end of the first page and ask Ingrid if we have any questions. So we'll continue through that in that vein as we go through the next stage in my presentation. So in terms of what you see on the screen, hopefully it's quite visible to you. We have the overarching principles for patient involvement throughout the medicine's research and development process. Now these principles actually are reflected in each of the 4 guidance documents. And really what they do is they cover the interaction to make sure that it's structured. They take account of what healthcare systems are in place, and to make sure that legislation, to make sure that when you're having an interaction, remember that legislation in different countries might be different to, the UK, for example. It also has principles around, the stakeholder engagement must be a collaborative approach. There might be multi-stakeholders involved. to acknowledge that patient involvement actually enriches the quality and evidence and opinion when you're developing a medicine. Across the principles, we also find that the entire medicines R&D process is covered. So again, as I mentioned on my slides, we're not just talking about patient involvement in clinical development here, we're really spanning the entire medicines development process. You could actually deviate from the guidance documents that EUPATI has produced in specific circumstances, or where there's legislation or a need of a different interaction. And the guidance should be adapted using best professional judgment as well. So that's really what's covered in the principles that you see here listed on the screen. Also, more importantly as well, what we covered in terms of the guidance documents was a set of values. So we really tried to make sure that we could cover these across the 4 guidance documents. And the 4 values you'll see on the screen now is relevance, fairness, equity, and capacity building. And we really thought this was important. And also, as you'll see as I scroll down, we do have a disclaimer, which is, again, is not intended. We're not intending to have guidance documents very detailed and step by step, but it's really there to be a high-level kind of guidance for people. And also the legal advice is recommended when required. So again, this is a disclaimer that we have here to help people as they work through the document and apply that in their own situations. So I'm going to pause there and see, Ingrid, are there any questions about what I've said so far?
No, there were more general questions concerning the availability of the webinar afterwards and the presentation and the pre-reading. So I didn't see any other questions.
Okay, thanks for that. So I will continue, but do interrupt me, Ingrid, if there's anything that's burning that comes up as I speak. Okay?
Just one question came up, Ingrid. It says these documents are of great help. You mentioned different legislation in different countries. Do you identify these specifically?
No, so we don't actually at the moment. That is down to the person reading the document to go and find that legislation and those the codes of conduct, etc., for their country that they're operating in and having that patient interaction in. So I think that's a really important point to make. At the end of the guidance document, there isn't a whole great list of different codes of practice in different countries, or different codes. Or legal legislation. We didn't go into that level of detail. Okay, so I will continue. So next, in terms of the pages in the guidance document, on page 3 there is an introduction, which are essentially covered by my previous slides. The scope is for the European Union. So you'll see here it's a European guidance, and it covers the interaction between patients and the pharmaceutical industry throughout the medicines R&D life cycle, as I mentioned earlier. The European guidance is for all functions in industry R&D, okay? But also, even though we say this is for industry, we could actually, this guidance document could actually be applied to academic and other organisations, or, for example, investigators in clinical trials, to some degree, and with some of the important elements, but we do recognise that the guidance document wouldn't 100% cover this or apply to this kind of interaction. So that's just something to consider. Okay, yeah, I think that's all I want to say on that page. And then here is the roadmap that I mentioned earlier. So we spent some time in EUPATI looking at the various steps in the process of patients' involvement in medicines R&D. And actually, here you'll see in the diagram, it does actually illustrate where patients can be involved across the life cycle. And at the bottom of the page, bottom of the diagram here, you'll see some examples of what that involvement may look like. So, for example, in patient information, it might be the content of an information leaflet, it might be the visual design, it might be readability, the language that's used, or the way that the information is shared with patients. Okay, just going down to the next piece, which here, as I mentioned earlier, is actually defining what we mean by patient. As I mentioned previously, EUPATI spent a lot of time trying to make these definitions very clear. The term patient is often used very generally, but it does cover a number of different individuals who have a say in the way that medicines are developed, and we really wanted to take some time and make sure this was clear in the guidance document. So you'll see here as I track through, we cover carers, patient advocates, patient organisation representatives, and patient experts, which I'm sure is a term that you've heard quite frequently across your conversations. And I think a key point here is that there may be reservations about actually involving individual patients, but it really actually should be to the discretion of the organisations initiating the interaction to choose the most adequate patient representation in terms of the activity that they're taking forward. And you'll see that more closely covered in section 7 when I go through. So really we wanted to make sure that all patients were involved. We're not being descriptive about particular patients being involved in any interactions. It should really be open to everyone. There should be no distinction there. Okay, Ingrid, I'm just going to pause there and see if there's anything you wish to add.
Well, I do not see any new questions, so please, audience, if you have questions here on the definition of patients, for example, I can hardly believe that you do not have your own thoughts, because we in EUPATI, we discussed forever about these definitions and had really a hard time to nail these definitions down, but they are certainly very relevant to have a better possibility to make more concrete discussions about what type of expertise or knowledge from patient side is relevant for what type of task that requires this advising or involvement. But perhaps Wolf or David, would you like to comment here?
No comment at this point, no.
Okay, well, I see here one question. Thank you for the invitation. As a patient, I feel personally a gap between patient involvement and organizations of R&D. In this guidance, you use a meta view of this interaction and about a simple and clear language for patients. How do you want to do this? Okay, so it's a meta view of this interaction and about a simple and clear language for patients. How do you want to do this? It's a bit a difficult question, Kay.
Yeah.
Cosima, you asked this question. Would you mind to give us a bit more feedback on or explanation on what you mean with that question?
Yeah, I think, Ingrid, just reading the question now on my screen, I'm thinking whether this is actually around the connection between the patient who wants to be involved and the industry who want to involve the patient, and how they bring the two, how they connect each other in. And I think this is something that I've recognised within GSK, if I'm right in how the question has been framed, in that we want to involve patients and we have particular opportunities and activities to achieve that. But unless we kind of put that out there as an opportunity and make that public in some way, or make that approach out to different organisations, the patients won't know that there's opportunities. So I think maybe it might be around that.
Yeah, I think that is a possibility, and probably we will come back to that question later in the context of later section when we talk about the interaction and the collaboration, and that of course also includes the question on how the two parties can find together and make sure that patients who are interested find a way to get involved, which we all know is very difficult to achieve in practice. So I think, Kay, in the interest of time, why don't you continue then, please?
Sure, okay. So there's one other key point I want to make before I move on to transparency, which is this last sentence here around the type of input and mandate of the involved person should be agreed in any collaborative process or engagement. And I think that's really important. It should be really clear to make sure that the patient's expectations are managed and the person who's organising the interaction manages their expectations as well. And I think that's really, really key. In addition to that, is also making sure that the patient is prepared for the interaction, and that may include training. It may include, you know, a discussion with the person they're going to be interviewed on the day, etc., etc. There are many different ways of obviously preparing people for that discussion. And obviously here I want to mention EUPATI's toolbox, you know, that is available since January last year, where you can go in and you know, essentially search for information around the medicines development process, you know, from A to Z. So if you are in the future going to be involved as a patient in you know, the drug development process, then here is an opportunity to utilise EUPATI content to upskill you before that activity takes place. Okay, so I'm going to move on to transparency section now. So the transparency section really covers disclosure of patient involvement activities. We really want organisations to start sharing publicly what they're doing with patients, but obviously, you know, we don't want it down to the individual patient name level or, you know, or health information. You know, that's really important. But I think it's come a time now where we need really, as an industry, need to start sharing what we're doing. As I mentioned previously, we have those 22 case studies from EUPATI, but it's a drop in the ocean. There's a lot more going on, but I think we need to be more open to sharing that information. That's something that I'm trying to drive within GSK. Also, as well, you know, we need to recognise that there are some disease areas that are rare, so there will be parallel interactions, and these shouldn't be depressed in any way. You know, they shouldn't be prevented. You know, regulatory authorities and industry should be working with patients, you know, irrespective of what that interaction is. However, they should be disclosed. Okay, next on to suggested working practices. Really, the key point here is that we want to make sure that the interactions with patients are in a partnership model, you know, and they are established over a long term. What we don't want to see within EUPATI is, you know, interactions that happen very ad hoc once in a while. We want to see patient partnerships, and I think that's a really strong message that we've tried to instill in this guidance document. Now, we do recognise that, you know, ad hoc interactions will probably start off the long-term partnerships, but we really do see that evolving into, you know, a longer-term relationship. What we've also asked the industry to think about is that they have the cross-functional coordination with defined liaison roles within the companies as a best practice, so that we can really start to make sure that, you know, if you're involving patients, it just doesn't happen in one particular area. It is something that happens across the company. Okay, and then as I mentioned previously, pre-engagement discussions should take place to make sure that there is adequate interaction and preparation before the interaction takes place. Okay, Ingrid, just going to pause there in terms of any questions before I go on to defining the interaction.
Yes, there are questions. There was one question going back to before you started to talk about transparency, and this was, you mentioned mandate. What did you mean with mandate, Kay?
Yeah, so really it's about what you're going to be doing as a patient within the project. What is the objective of your interaction with an industry partner, for example? And I think that's you know, what I would cover as a mandate. You know, what are you being asked to do? What is the objective of your interaction with a partner? You know, so that it's very clear to you what the expectations are. Wolf, David, I don't know if you want to jump in here and add to that.
Not really.
Okay.
Okay,
You're happy
then
with my description.
There's another question, Kay, which is more of a general question, and perhaps I can give the lead for the answer to Wolf to get also another company involved here, and this is about. Sorry, now it jumped out of my screen here again. One moment. It is about the successful patient involvement in R&D as a result of a combination of two factors: industry willingness to involve patients, and secondly, patients' ability to contribute fully. And of course, we have done a lot in EUPATI to do that. The question was how to ensure that patient involvement is not simply the result of an individual decision within the company. How do we make it more formalized? Should advocacy efforts more strongly be aimed at public law or policy makers or industry decision makers, internal guidelines developers, in your view? Wolf, would you like to start?
Well, that's a good question. I just tried to read it on my screen too. What I believe is that this guidance document, for instance, is one of the steps we can take to make this type of involvement more generalized and more formalized by offering guidance specifically to that. With respect to lawmakers and decision makers, one point is lawmakers will probably see this, but the question is if they will pick up on a guidance like this or on other guidances which are in existence and put that into a formalized legal environment. As we have stated in the guideline, much of what is done and what can be done in this respect is within the realm of the national legislation. I rather doubt that something can be done on even a national level or a European level in that sense.
Okay, I think this is certainly right. A push from up, top down, so to say, from the legal or regulatory environment into the pharma companies is probably going to be difficult. I agree on that. But Kay, would you have an idea on that?
Yeah, so I think it is going to be driven potentially by the regulatory authorities. I think the industry is going to be challenged more in the future, particularly what we've seen from the FDA and EMA. They're looking at having their own patient panels and patient committees, and they're actually having more of a strategic approach to patient involvement. So I think we will be driven by that in the future, and I think it's probably a couple of years away, but I would hope that would be something where we would be driven by that. But I think even with that, I think companies should make the start already, and some companies are well along the journey, and others are still trying to figure out how they might involve patients in the future. But we shouldn't wait for the regulatory stick, if you like.
No, certainly not, and probably this is Wolf again, and probably this might be associated with a little carrot. But with respect to the top-down approach, I think with the companies it is definitely important that the drive to involve patients along the R&D chain, which means not only in clinical but way before, but also way after, by management, and also be driven by those who are intrinsically involved with having patients' voices heard, like in clinical. It has to cover all functions of a company which are involved in research and development, and that is a major task, I have to admit.
Well, Wolf, we had a very bad connection partly, but I think your overall your view was well understood. So I think one other possibility would, of course, be that there is, as Kay said, before we get, let's say, a legal requirement of patient involvement, that it would probably be really meaningful and helpful if on the industry side, within the industry infrastructure, there would be more voluntary activities and agreements, and so the question is, for example, in FPR, whether there could be a type of FPR internal guidance or recommendation or code of conduct or something like that, that would really make it internally mandatory for member companies or associations to find a best practice, a joint best approach, a jointly developed best approach, how to ensure this broad involvement of patients all through the life cycle, and not to wait until this comes from the regulatory side.
Well, as a matter of fact, I mean, EUPATI is a prime example for FPR getting involved in exactly these areas.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Kay, I think we can continue.
Okay, happy to. Okay, so the next section I'm going to cover is defining the interaction. So as you'll see here on the screen, there's a bulleted list of things that you need to consider prior to each interaction. And these, basically are the objective of the interaction, what the input is and the mandate, as I mentioned previously, the tools and the methods, what patient profile is. In term, when I say patient profile, is what sort of patient are you trying to engage? Would it be a patient representative, an individual patient, groups of patients? Would they be from a specific community? Would they be adults, children, young people, etc., etc.? So a whole gamut of considerations there. Whether you want to partner with a patient organisation or a patient, how outputs will be used and who's going to own those outputs. And also, more importantly, from my perspective now, as I move forward in my work at GSK, is making sure that the patients are informed of what has been decided as an outcome of the interaction. I think that's fundamentally important to really encourage patients to be involved in research in the future. And then also, obviously, the contract terms, which I'll go on to discuss in a moment, the written agreement in the written agreement section. And as I track down, there's the patient identification, which I mentioned earlier. Many people have asked questions, how do we find the patients? So we covered that in the EUPATI guidance as well. And you'll see there's a whole list of ways of finding or identifying patients. Then on to compensation. So really, we had a very thorough discussion about compensation, but we didn't go into the level of what the fees should be, although a number of our industry partners were looking for that level of detail. We just weren't simply able to go into that discussion. But what we have said is that, obviously we recognise that many patients are involved in activities that are actually volunteers, but they may also be a member of an organisation, may need to take holiday, as part of that to be involved. We wanted to make sure that patients were compensated for their total time invested, including any expenses. We wanted to make sure that any compensation that was offered would be fair and appropriate for the type of engagement. But obviously, as I say, we haven't gone into the level of detail of defining what that is. Ideally, travel costs would be paid directly by the partner organising the activity. We didn't want patients to be out of pocket. We wanted them to be, to have the accommodation or travel booked in advance and prepaid. We wanted to make sure that, if patient organisations are actually identifying patients on behalf of industry, for example, then any costs incurred by that should be covered as well. And also that would, cover things like supporting the patients and with their interaction or in terms of preparation or training. And then also, fundamentally, we need to make sure that the organisations organising the interaction would help with logistics of patient participation, as I mentioned previously, travel and or accommodation. And then, we talked about compensation being inclusive of indirect benefits in kind, such as, a patient organisation providing a service free of charge, or any other non-financial benefits, such as, training sessions, agency services, or setting up a website to identify patients. And also, just going back to transparency message about, making sure that compensation arrangements are disclosed. And then, as I mentioned previously, the written agreement, we'd spent some time talking about that, and we discussed whether we should provide, templates in this guidance document to provide an example, if you like, of what we would want to see in a written agreement, but we stopped short of that because there are a number of different templates that different industry partners within EUPATI are using at the moment. It was very difficult to have a uniform approach, but I think, going forward, that's something we might need to consider in either EUPATI or a different project, or through FPIA, as mentioned previously. But essentially, at a minimum, the written agreement should cover, consent, the release, how we're going to be using any recordings or any patient information. Clearly, confidentiality, data privacy is very important. Compensation, any declarations of conflicts of interests, and things like timelines. How often is the patient going to be engaged? Is it a one-off activity? A one-to-one discussion or telephone conference, etc. Or are they going to be? Are there going to be several interactions over a period of time? And to make sure that the basic elements for the collaboration are actually covered. And again, here, we said that care should be taken to make sure that the agreements that are provided to patients are actually very clear. Sometimes you might see written agreements that are very legalese in their language, and what I'm trying to work towards in GSK is a more patient-friendly approach. And also what we want to try and do is make sure that non-sharing isn't limited. And then moving on to events and hospitality, there's varied methods of interaction, as I mentioned previously, face-to-face meetings, telephone discussions, but these should be discussed and mutually agreed. And the convenience of the patient, being able to interact is the main priority. So, for example, an industry group may want to arrange a focus group at a particular venue or location, but that may not work for patients, and you may need to rethink that approach. You might want to have one-to-one face-to-face discussions with a patient, but they may not be able to travel. So think about having Skype interviews instead. These are things that sound very simple, but people don't take the time to really think that through. And I think, we wanted to make that clear in the guidance document, to give thought and consideration to how, the method of interaction. And more importantly as well, is to make sure that you do follow the existing codes of conduct, local legislation, etc., and to ensure that you don't fall foul of any of those local laws. And again, when you're organising, conferences, for example, make sure that the ability of any intended patient audience to attend is considered. Take measures to ensure they're able to access the building. Do they need travel assistance? Do they want to travel with someone, to accompany them to the event? Can they, gain entry into all the events that are offered? Not just one particular part of the conference. So I think, we tried to spend time on that as well, because we do see that as a barrier in some cases. And then finally, the Appendix 1 just covers the code of practices that we did review, as I mentioned previously when we were drafting the guidance document. And I just finally wanted to mention the things that we don't cover in the guidance document. Some of the points I've already mentioned previously about the level of fees, that you might hear instances of fair market value being bandied around. We didn't go into that level of detail. We didn't provide legal advice. That's down to the organisations and the different stakeholders. We didn't provide specific how-to steps because this document would end up being like 40 pages. We didn't provide templates, as I mentioned previously. But again, that's something that might be worked on by a different project or by FPIA, for example. So I'm going to stop there. I've kind of finished what I was going to say, but happy to take any further questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kay. I think this was a very good compilation of thoughts and decisions that we made after long discussions on how to touch and how to present some of the very key topics of the interaction between patients and the pharma side. I think we have very concrete topics here, and you also said talked about the concrete topics that were not covered here for different reasons. I think when we start with the discussions of the discussion in the order of the document, the first thing that we really would need to talk about is how to start the interaction from not only from finding each other's, but then from defining the project and making clear that what the expectations are and also what each party is able or willing to deliver, contribute, and what will happen with the outcome of that interaction, of the consultation. Is there any recommendation that is perhaps has been discussed but has not found an expression here in that guidance in a more concrete way, how this definition of the work could be managed? Is the contract the only possibility, or are there other documents that should be prepared, or other preparational descriptions in whatever way?
Yeah, so Ingrid, if I can give an example from GSK, if I may, I think that might help. So within the process that I follow internally within GSK, I actually ask any teams that approach me who want to engage patients to provide almost like a project form. Now, it's not a lengthy document, it's a one-page document, but it really sets out the things that we've got in our guidance document, what they need to be thinking about, how they need to describe the interaction with the patient. And then, further along the process, once we've identified a patient or patients, it's having that conversation with them before we get to the written agreement to say, this is what we want to do, this is how your involvement will take place, this is what we were hoping to achieve, what do you think, are there things that we need to consider, are you still interested? And at that point then we would then introduce the written agreement, which would then cover the nuts and bolts of the interaction. But there's that conversation that needs to happen before you get to that written agreement stage to really clearly outline, face-to-face or on the telephone, this is what the expectations are, this is how we want to manage the interaction, what do you think, how do you want to shape it, are you comfortable being interviewed, are there questions that you have of us that you want to raise, etc., etc. And it's all about having that really holistic approach to patient engagement. So at the end of the day, before you get to the interaction, both parties are really clear on what's expected. Okay.
David, would you want to comment here from your experience? Has this, in your former involvement with pharma companies, been always clearly defined up front, or were there areas of confusion or misunderstanding? David?
I'm here. The code is the code, but it requires implementation. And in my experience, we had problems in the beginning when we started in 1997, getting the different companies on the same line. And I could still say that in the European Community Advisory Board, not every company follows the practice we would like to, or follows the rules we would like to have. For instance, not every company is ready to have us reviewing their trial protocols at planning stage. We are not there with everybody, but they follow all the basic setup of our interaction with the companies. At the EADG, we only talk of ongoing interaction with companies. The code, the guidance we developed here at EUPATI is not making such a difference, meaning that it covers the possibility that a company or an organization has only a one-off thing and a short interaction of a couple of weeks or one day on a very specific question, and then that's it. So this needs to be possible. However, it is not the model my organization has been implementing. So it depends very much when you are on the patient side how you want to do your job, how much time you have, how much people you have, what's the scope and the horizon of your interaction. These are things you need to clarify internally before even starting an interaction.
Yeah, I think this is certainly a very important experience, and I think it's everyone, every party who goes into this collaboration, whether it's on the industry side or on the patient side, will certainly make different experiences, and it will certainly be sometimes more successful and sometimes less successful, probably also sometimes frustrating. One question is about is there a possibility to measure whether this was now a successful interaction or not?
Yes, David Wolf, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, I was just waiting till the ringing stopped.
So was I.
Sorry.
And I hope you can understand me better now. I think this is one of the major tasks for the future, to devise metrics for all parties involved, both patients, patient organizations, and industry, to see what the outcome of an interaction, be it in the very early stages or in clinical development or even later, will give. One problem I see there is that given the timelines which development of a medicine takes, I mean years and years, it will be hard to measure the impact of an interaction on a short-term scale. And we are far from having sound metrics to say, yes, an interaction here or there has led to such and such.
Now he is gone, but
He's gone completely.
But I think, yes, the question of metrics is something that obviously still needs to be achieved, and there is a new IMI project in the making that will hopefully fill that gap in a meaningful way. At the moment, and until this project will come up with, let's say, usable tools that everybody can apply, I think it's really a matter of following very carefully every, and also from an outside view, so to say, every collaboration opportunity between or project between industry and patients, and to have, for example, a feedback session at the end to see whether there was an immediate effect of that collaboration, and then perhaps on a in a periodic way from time to time see whether this interaction had a long-term effect. But I think at the moment that is all I can imagine now. But Kay, perhaps, and perhaps if Wolf is back, or David, you have your own thoughts.
I'm happy to say something. I think it is mainly on the industry side where people are so keen to measure and to have matrices. On the patient side, there is less of a pressure doing that, because there is not necessarily such an economic pressure on the interaction. There is either satisfaction or dissatisfaction, and you can measure that immediately. That's a matter of the gut feeling and a matter of how well the interaction went and how satisfied people are. What I would recommend in the absence of matrices is having debriefings after every meeting and after every interaction, and share the outcomes of these internal debriefings with the other partner.
Okay, I think that is probably a really very
that's much more hands-on. That's much more hands-on.
Yes, and I mean, from that is a typical issue of a consultant situation. When you go in as a consultant in a consultant role into whatever collaboration with somebody who wants the involvement or wants the advice, then I think the consultant as such has not much of a chance to see or measure the impact other than getting a feel and also some feedback whether the other party is satisfied with the advice, whether this advice was considered helpful or not, and also to get an opportunity to see whether this advice was taken into consideration. I think for the consultant and the patient in that aspect is a consultant, is the only way to really see whether this is worthwhile to do, is successful to do or not. On the industry side, it's very clear there. It's more the long-term metrics that play a role, whether that investment into making this additional effort, and this is how quite a lot of industry people see this involvement of patients. It's an additional effort to get this advice, to make that advice viable, whether this investment makes a difference or not. Okay, so I think we will see in future only whether ultimately there is a measurable effect, but I think from a patient point of view, it is already a good feeling and an appreciation that there is an opportunity to provide that information to those who will have to make something out of it, who will have to use that information to make better treatments. And I think this opportunity is really, really rewarding. Nevertheless, we have this discussion about compensation, and one of the comments was that we should stop avoiding becoming precise in that topic. We had this discussion in that guidance document preparation as well, quite intensively, and I think Wolf and David and Kay, you were the key main authors here. Why did you ultimately decide to not become more precise in recommendations here and in that topic, how the compensation should be handled?
A, we didn't have the time to go into that, and B, we would have gotten lost anyway, because what was needed here and possible within EUPATI was producing a guidance that helps you establishing an interaction on an exchange on research and development, product development. And this was really the goal we had in mind. If you then get sidetracked by specific issues like compensation, you just lose the track, or you need a lot more time.
Okay, yeah, well, I think this is a very important point. This discussion is or this topic is really very, very difficult to solve. First of all, the conditions are very different of the interaction. The expectations are different. The level of work or time involved is very different. And to find a general approach to that is a challenge. And we definitely didn't at that time in EUPATI. I remember that very well. But I think this also requires quite a large consultation specifically on that point to see what is happening at the moment already, to see what is expected from the different partners, and to see whether there's a possibility to find patterns or a scheme for defining in more detail how to approach what type of interaction from a financial point of view. I think that is certainly something that still needs to be further defined. There are, of course, also then concrete issues with a payment that even if there is a payment, for example, of travel expenses or a fee, then the next point is that this payment should really be made in a timely way, and that there is not a need for the patient to follow up and push for the payment, because that could also then at the end be felt as being quite embarrassing and hamper, let's say, the good spirit of that collaboration. Kay, would you see any, let's say, recommendation on payment conditions, without going now into sums or whatever, but really how to manage this payment process?
Yeah, and I've had recent examples of where it's worked well and where it hasn't worked well. It is, you know, very different within each company, obviously. I think this is something that could potentially be within the written agreement. So you have a payment within 30 days, for example, as a general rule. I think that would be something that we would need to instill. But it is down, obviously, to company practices and processes and how they, you know, managing their finances systems. And the bigger the company, the tougher it gets, and it's something that I'm having a challenge with at the moment, to be quite honest. So yeah, there's still some work to be done on that front. Yeah, so I think probably within the written agreement as a rule would be good.
What I would like to add here is flag something important when a company is inviting people to a meeting or to a conference or whatever, is that provisions are made that at least the travel is covered by a travel agency and does not have to be advanced by the attending people themselves.
Yeah.
This is often a hurdle for people.
Yeah, and that, I mean, this is Wolf again, and that is why we put that specifically into the guidance, because that is something which is often a point of even people not attending an invitation.
Yeah, we definitely identified that as a barrier very early on.
Yeah, I think this is clearly something that should be taken into consideration and really work well. We have certainly also seen in companies that the instruction for payment are made by the concerned department, but the finance department has then different rules and handles things in different priority. And I think that is also quite often where this interaction is then stuck, and where this following up and having to go back then to the for example, the research department is felt to be embarrassing, because the interaction with another department in that company does not work so smoothly. So I think when companies think about their approach to patient engagement, that element of the interaction should also be clarified very clearly, so that this interaction between the, let's say, advised department and the finance department works then smoothly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Okay. There was one other comment which I think is also, Nick has already left, unfortunately, but I think it's still a very important topic that was also one of the discussions in that guidance when we developed that guidance document. And this was the role of the professional patient advocate, a person who does not suffer from a particular disease, but rather offers paid consultancy on a specific disease which they do not suffer from. What should be their role? How helpful is that? Are there special conditions, special reasons when it's particularly meaningful to have this type of involvement and engagement?
Well, you have disease areas where patients cannot be consulted, like Alzheimer, like other neurologic disorders. And there you need the professional patient representatives, and this is also exactly the reason why we have listed this group as one potential partner for establishing an interaction. In other indications like rare diseases, the patients affected might be children. So you cannot consult the children, but maybe their parents. They are also listed as carers, as being a partner to talk with. So we should see the value of every possible player and not play them out against each other.
Okay, I think this is certainly, but would that mean that this interaction is then primarily for those type of patients, or let's say in more general adult disease indications, there is also a role for patient organization representatives who do not suffer from the disease?
I think it depends very much on the disease area, and it depends on the situation. Whom do you meet first, and how well the patient side is organized, how easy it is for patients to come out or to be engaged. Let's talk about HIV. When you go to countries in the Muslim world, you will have huge troubles finding patients themselves. So when you go to Russia or Central Asia, you have huge troubles finding patients themselves, but you find organizations working with them. And so you have to be open and creative enough, depending on the specific circumstances you are in.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It certainly depends on the circumstances and the overall possibility for patients to participate in these discussions themselves. But when I hear you, then this is more, let's say, a substitute strategy in those cases where either the patient, because of the disease or the disability, cannot do it by himself, or where the social context is not so that patients would be able or allowed to out themselves to be a patient. I think it is this problem of outing and presenting yourself as a patient is a problem, most probably for many patients anyway. And I think patient organizations play a very important role as a voice for those patients who want to be represented but don't dare or don't feel comfortable telling the rest of the world that they are a patient. In so far, I think the role of patient organizations is really important in all type of indications. The question is only how do patient organizations organize themselves so that those people who do not suffer themselves are still enough knowledgeable and representative for that patient community. I think that is a challenge to the patient organizations, because patient organizations have also the need to find these people, that staff that is then doing that job. And these people need on one hand to know enough about the disease, but on the other hand feel comfortable enough to represent the disease and defend the interests and discuss the interests and the needs then in such an expert environment like pharma companies or competent authorities or whatever. And I think that is a real challenge for patient organizations to get these people then and train and educate them and make them knowledgeable enough. How are patient organizations doing?
Agree, but I would like to add something here, which seems important to me. What we did in my Swiss organization and also in EATG is we don't only have affected patients, infected patients as members. Some of our members have specialist know-how and do not live with the disease, and we did this to secure the necessary expertise in the group, and B, to prevent that the membership in the organization is an automatic diagnosis versus the outside world. So the people interacting or organizations interacting with us do not necessarily know if the person is living with the disease or not. And I can tell you that some staff people or some people not living with the disease are as good as the ones living with it. They don't have the genuine experience of the disease, but they have acquired so much know-how and so much knowledge and so much empathy over time, developed such empathy over time, they are as good as a person living with the disease.
Okay. Kay, from your experience, have you worked with patient organization representatives, or is it more with individual patients or patients living with a disease and being expert? What type of patients did you interact with?
Yeah, so Ingrid, I've worked with a mixture of patients over the last 9 years. I mean, in some interactions or activities, as I like to call them, we've only wanted to speak to individual patients, and we've interviewed them one-on-one but separately. In some instances, we've run focus groups where we've had patient advocates and patients involved as a group discussion. So it really has been a mixture. And I think it's, as David said, it's down to defining, you know, what the interaction is and who you want to involve and what makes sense. I think that's really important. But there is a role for everyone, as I stated earlier, and I think that's really important to remember as you go through the patient involvement cycle.
Okay, perhaps someone in the audience would like to share experience with that. What type of, let's say, knowledge or involvement in the disease was helpful for the interaction in a particular question with a pharma company? I'm just looking whether anyone wants to share here some experiences. At the moment, I do not see anything yet. David, from your experience, what would you say, which type of questions, or at what stage in the development of new medicines did you feel that having a patient organization representative was particularly helpful, and perhaps more helpful than an enthusiastic but let's say R&D naive patient?
I got the first part of your question, not the second one. The first part, from which stage the patient involvement is really important, I think that's an easy one. That's from phase 2, when you go into dose finding. And you have the phase 1 results, which is usually done in people who are not living with the disease, its toxicity, and the dose is not established. But as soon as you try to establish a dose, you are going with the drug into people living with the disease, and this is really the moment where you need to speak to patients. And then in phase 3 anyway, and in phase 4 too. And I think that's the area people should focus on when establishing an interaction. I have experienced an interesting moment when my organization went into a basic research consortium for the first time. All we had learned before didn't count anymore, and we had to reinvent a little bit the wheel on how to interact with people doing basic research, because the questions are very different. And it was, for me personally, quite a challenge getting involved at this level. Did I answer your question, or?
Yeah. The second part I meant, for example, when it's a discussion about the patient information sheet for a clinical trial, would that be a place for, let's say, a patient with a respective disease, and naive concerning R&D methodology. So what we have defined an individual patient, would that be a good place for?
Absolutely. That's something we had always done at EADG from the very beginning. Looking at the patient information sheet, does this make sense? Is this understood? And actually, it has been a major pain in our necks because so many of these information materials came from the US and had many pages and were not understandable and were not useful at all. And what we were crying for many years was having European legislation making this information actually understandable and getting the amount and the level of information down to something that a normal person can digest and understand. In the end, companies and sponsors tend to overload this material with tons of information, and in the end, the patient hasn't understood anything. There should be, I'm very much lobbying for a reduced approach, saying what is necessary and leaving room for questions and focusing actually on the process of consenting people to a study and to a trial.
Okay.
I guess I couldn't agree more, David. What is a hindrance in this aspect is sometimes the legal requirements of what you have to put into an information sheet or in any information you give, unfortunately, and to find a balance is very hard indeed. But what one can do and what one should do is definitely, as we mention also in the guidance, to adjust the language so that it is understood by someone who is not a specialist in a given area. I would like to add one more point. You gave an example, and that is when a patient or an organization becomes involved at early steps of R&D. It is definitely helpful if you have a background which allows you to look at the process and the methodology irrespective of the disease you may cover or not. I mean, obviously, the ideal would be to have someone who has experience in the disease and lives with the disease, but also has a sound background in terms of R&D. I mean, that's one of the main objectives the EUPATI course had, to give patients a broader background in the R&D methodology, in the processes, to be able to talk beyond their specific disease experience with those who are involved in the actual process in industry or in academia.
Yeah, that is certainly one of the key ideas and basic attempts of the EUPATI project, and I'm really very glad and proud, and I think we can say that here, that we achieved that so far, and we see already now that our trainees do a fantastic job in having taken up the ball and bringing that knowledge further and distributing that further, and also the toolbox is very successful. Kay, I have one question concerning the level of engagement and the level of, let's say, agreement that has to be prepared. What would you say, how should the guidance be interpreted? Is there a difference whether this is a once-off interaction of a patient with a patient organization versus a more strategic long-term involvement? Would you say that we need an agreement, a written contract for every short-term engagement in the same way as for a long one?
Yeah, and that's certainly the process that we follow within GSK. We actually have a written agreement for every interaction. because you know, depending on what it is and the length of the interaction, you know, you still need to cover consent. You still need to make sure, you know, you're following the data privacy rules, that you've got you know, confidentiality covered. So you know, it's irrespective of whether the activity is a short-term or long-term, you know, partnership. And I think, you know, if it's a long-term partnership, you probably would need to review the agreement probably every year to make sure it's still fit for purpose. But yeah, the GSK practice is that you have a written agreement for every interaction.
Okay, so that is really a clear recommendation from this guideline that there should not be any interaction between patient and industry without a written agreement that covers, at least to some degree, the topic that you have raised.
I add something here. I think it's really important for every type of interaction that you have agreed on the goals and the scope of the interaction. And I think it is a matter of good business practice to have that in writing.
Okay. Okay, I think this is a very important element of this guidance, that there should really be that time in preparation on one hand, and also the discipline to do that. And the question that comes the next, of course, is there a template? Does every company have to start that from scratch? Or are there, let's say, examples that people could use or that could become more general? I remember when we prepared this guidance, there was at some stage a template foreseen as an attachment, but in the final version that was then not anymore the case. Okay, what was the reason?
Yeah, so we did consider including templates of written agreements, for example, in the guidance document. But there are so many different templates out there that industry partners within the consortium use that it would take, again, time, as David has mentioned about the, you know, the fee levels. It would take a considerable amount of time to even produce one, you know, generic template that would suit all partners, because, you know, there are different approaches in each company. There are different legal departments. You know, one particular aspect of a patient involvement may be different to another industry partner. So it is a minefield. So we couldn't provide that level of, you know, information, you know, for the guidance document. But it's certainly something I think the new IMI project that was mentioned previously would hopefully deliver, and I think it would be a really good step forward.
Okay. There are probably also national differences, because some aspects cover or are covered by national legislation, and that would also have to be taken into consideration. So coming up with such a template would certainly be very, very helpful, but it might need to be a template per country, for example, to make sure that that the national legislation is properly covered.
Yeah, exactly. You need that layer to be added to, you know, any generic template.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't see any further questions. This is not really helpful. Well, there is one I did not read so far. From my personal perspective as patient and patient representative, the problem is that the interaction with pharma industry happens many times at the end of the project, activity, development, research, etc. So the patient's feedback is not really helpful to be considered by the industry, and the challenge for both is to have the opportunity to be part of many processes together since the beginning, bringing our patient's perspective and improving this interaction. Thanks for this interesting webinar. So, well, thank you very much for this positive comment. Any comments from your end, Wolf or Kay, that it's really coming too late and not really helpful?
Well, I really like this comment, and thanks a lot. But that also shows me again that it is extremely important that we are not only trying to reach out to the patient community, but also within the companies to the different departments which are involved at different steps of the R&D chain, to make them aware of where and how they can involve patients. And that would be my final.
Yeah, I mean, we have, this made me think about an experience that I'm making quite regularly. EFGCP is quite often invited to join a consortium for a publicly funded project, and we get then invited, and quite often this is a week before the deadline for submission of the proposal, when somebody realized, oh my God, we need to have something about ethics. Could EFGCP come in and help? And of course, at that stage, first of all, it's really last minute, and at that stage, not many things can be changed anymore, and really relevant aspects of the project yeah, simply cannot be decided anymore in a different way. I think the comment here stems from a similar experience, that this idea, oh my God, we need a patient voice, comes relatively late in the project development, and then it is too late to make really a meaningful change anymore. And even if the group says, oh yes, that would have been really important, it is often then not too late to make really major changes. So I think your proposal to, or your plea to have the patient involved as early as possible, and to make the departments in the company think about this early on and not at a last minute fixing condition, I think is a major relevant aspect in that interaction between pharma companies and patients. And I think this guidance will hopefully help to raise awareness, to make people aware that it can be done, that it's already broadly done, and but it's only successful if it's handled in a professional way, with thinking and mutual respect and mutual interest in the collaboration from the beginning of the development of that project.
I add something here. I think the remark is also a hint to the patient side, and should show people how important it is having an established interaction with the companies who work in the indication the organization is dealing with. So insisting having such an interaction might be a good starting point, because until you have it, the established interaction, you quite spend some time. If you are not used to work with each other, interaction is usually not that successful. But if you have established channels, if you have established working mechanisms, you would usually normally be consulted in a timely manner, and if not, you learn something out of it, and you revise your processes and the way you exchange the way you interact between the organization and the patient side and the company.
Okay, I think that's an excellent last word. Thank you very much, David. I would like to thank all three of you very much, and Ingrid and Matthew, for having organized this webinar. I hope those on the call had an opportunity to learn some more things, to get some good ideas, to have fruit for thoughts, and a next boost in working on making that collaboration of patients and pharmaceutical industry really work to the benefit of all patients and the better development of new treatments. I hope that I will hear and see you all in the next webinar, which will be on the guidance in collaboration with ethics committees. And this webinar will take place on Monday, the 29th of May. So please make sure that you have this in your calendar, and then we will talk about the interaction between patients and ethics committees, which is starting from a very different level with the very different needs and concepts. So hopefully I will get you all then again into these discussions, and I wish you a very nice evening. Thank you very much, and yeah, see you then hopefully, or hear you hopefully then in 2 weeks from now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.